The courthouse in the small American town of Westbridge had never seen so much attention. Its old stone walls, usually quiet except for minor hearings and routine disputes, now bore witness to one of the most talked-about trials in the state. Reporters gathered on the courthouse steps from dawn, their breath visible in the crisp morning air, as cameras clicked and microphones caught whispers of speculation. Locals stood in clusters outside, some clutching their coffee cups, others just curious onlookers drawn by the promise of drama. Inside, the courtroom itself hummed with nervous energy. Wooden benches groaned under the weight of dozens of spectators who had fought for seats, some arriving as early as sunrise. The ceiling fans turned slowly, barely stirring the thick tension. In the room, journalists scribbled furiously, eyes darting between the defendant, the attorneys, and the jury box, eager to capture even the smallest shift in expression. At the front, beneath the grand seal of justice mounted on the wall, sat Judge Harold Whitman, a man known for his strict adherence to fairness and order. His white hair, neatly combed back, gave him an air of dignity, but his piercing blue eyes revealed his unshakable focus. He tapped his gavel lightly on the polished wood, not to call order yet, but as if reminding everyone that this was no theater. It was a place where lives would be changed by truth. To his left, the prosecution team shuffled papers and reviewed evidence. Assistant District Attorney Melissa Carter, a sharp-minded woman with a reputation for tenacity, whispered final notes to her lead investigator. She was in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, and a presence that commanded attention without raising her voice. She had spent months preparing this case, and she knew that today would test every ounce of her skill. Across the room, the defense team looked just as polished, though their strategy was very different. Defense attorney Richard Callahan leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence. He was a man in his 50s with a booming voice and a flair for performance that often swayed juries. His client, seated beside him, wore a tailored suit, his dark hair slicked neatly back. But there was something unsettling about his stillness. He didn't fidget, didn't glance nervously around the room. He simply sat with his chin slightly raised, as though daring the room to judge him. The jury, 12 ordinary citizens polled from different corners of the county, shifted in their seats. Some clasped their hands tightly in their laps, others leaned forward, eyes sharp with curiosity. They had been warned not to discuss the case outside the courtroom, but the gravity of it weighed heavily on them. They weren't just deciding facts, they were holding the fate of a man, and perhaps the safety of a community, in their hands. But amidst the sea of adults, one figure stood out, a little girl no older than 7, seated quietly beside her mother in the second row. Her small legs dangled above the courtroom floor, swinging nervously as she clutched a worn-out teddy, bare to her chest. Her hair was tied in 2 uneven pigtails, and her wide brown eyes scanned the room, darting especially often to the police K-9 sitting at the side of an officer near the front. The German Shepherd was calm but alert, his coat gleaming under the soft light streaming through the tall windows. He sat upright, ears perked, his gaze fixed on his handler, yet every so often he glanced back at the audience. Most people barely gave the dog a second thought. Police dogs were often present in high-profile cases for security reasons. But for the little girl, he was more than just a dog. Every time her eyes fell on him, her grip on the teddy bear tightened, as though she was holding on to something far bigger than cloth and stuffing. Her mother, noticing the child's nervous stare, leaned down and whispered, "It's okay, sweetie. Just stay quiet. We're here to listen, nothing more." The little girl nodded, but her gaze didn't waver. The dog meant something to her, something that no one else in that courtroom understood yet. As the clock struck 9, Judge Whitman lifted his gavel and brought it down with a firm crack. The sound echoed across the chamber, silencing the murmurs and rustling papers. "This court is now in session," he declared, his deep voice steady and commanding. "We are here for the matter of the state versus Daniel Reeves." The name sent a ripple through the crowd. Daniel Reeves, the accused. His charges were serious, tied to events that had haunted the community for months. The prosecution claimed he was behind a series of violent crimes, but Reeves had maintained his innocence, his defense team insisting there was no direct evidence to prove otherwise. People whispered that the case could go either way, and many feared that a guilty man might walk free if the jury wasn't convinced. Melissa Carter rose from her seat, her papers neatly stacked, and addressed the jury. She painted a picture of the accused, of the crime, of the fear that had gripped families. Her words were measured, deliberate, each sentence crafted to appeal to both the jurors' sense of duty and their compassion. "We are here today," she concluded, "to ensure justice for the victims and safety for our community. Evidence will show that Daniel Reeves is guilty beyond reasonable doubt." Richard Callahan followed with his opening statement, striding confidently before the jury box. His tone was warm, almost charming, as though he were chatting with old friends. He reminded them of their duty to remain impartial, to question everything, to demand proof. "The prosecution," he said with a slight smile, "will ask you to believe stories, but belief is not enough in this courtroom. Proof is what matters, and you will see there is none." He ended with a dramatic pause, his hand resting on his client's shoulder as though to emphasize his faith in the man's innocence. The battle lines were drawn, and the trial was officially underway. Yet, as the lawyers returned to their seats, and the first witness was prepared to take the stand, the little girl's eyes remained fixed on the German Shepherd. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her small fingers digging into her teddy bears. Worn fur. Something about the dog held her in place, as if only he understood the truth she carried, but hadn't yet spoken. To most in the room, she was just a child sitting quietly beside her mother. But in the hours to come, she would become something else entirely, the voice no one had expected, the key to unraveling a case that seemed locked in shadows. For now, she sat unnoticed, her presence a quiet puzzle in a courtroom, buzzing with anticipation. And as the gavel struck again to call the first witness, the stage was set. None of them, neither judge, nor jury, nor attorneys, could have imagined how a child's gaze and a loyal police dog would soon shift the course of justice forever. The first witnesses had come and gone, each providing small fragments of the puzzle, but none with the kind of power that could completely sway the jury. A neighbor described hearing loud noises the night of the crime. A shop owner testified about seeing the accused near the area hours before it happened. A forensic expert spoke about traces of evidence that could have belonged to anyone. The case seemed balanced on a razor's edge. Each testimony offered weight, yet none crushed the defense's steady argument, reasonable doubt. Inside the courtroom, tension rose with every passing hour. The jurors scribbled notes in the small pads provided to them, some underlining key words, others frowning in concentration. Still, their shifting in seats, their darting eyes, revealed a growing unease. They wanted certainty, and so far, they hadn't found it. Daniel Reeves, the accused, sat in his chair unmoving, his expression carefully blank. His hands were folded neatly on the table, and every so often, he leaned slightly toward his attorney, whispering something that drew the faintest smirk from Richard Callahan. To the jury, he appeared calm. To those who knew him better, that calmness was chilling a mask perfected through years of practice. Melissa Carter, the prosecutor, knew this all too well. She had studied Reeves's mannerisms, watched hours of recordings, and seen firsthand how his composure could rattle witnesses. Today, though, she wasn't focused on him. She had one final element left to introduce, something unorthodox, something most wouldn't expect. She wasn't sure how the judge would react, nor how the jury would interpret it, but she knew she had to try. As the last scheduled witness stepped down, Melissa rose from her chair. A hush swept across the courtroom as she addressed Judge Whitman. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "the state has one additional demonstration to present." The judge adjusted his glasses and peered down at her. "A demonstration?" His voice carried both caution and curiosity. "Yes, Your Honor." Melissa turned toward the jury briefly, and back to the bench. "It involves an officer who was at the scene the night of the incident. More specifically, it involves his partner, the K-9 unit." A ripple of whispers surged through the courtroom. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously, while spectators exchanged wide-eyed looks. Even the jury stirred, several members glancing toward the officer, seated quietly in the corner, with the German Shepherd at his side. Callahan was on his feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor," he said sharply, his tone dripping with disbelief. "We are not here to watch a dog show. This is a criminal trial. Unless the state has a trained translator for canine language, I fail to see how this is admissible." A chuckle broke out among a few spectators, but the judge silenced them with a glare. "Miss Carter?" Melissa didn't flinch. "Your Honor, this K-9 was on duty the night in question. His reactions that evening were critical in guiding. Officers, and I believe his presence here today will corroborate the sequence of events. While of course he cannot speak, the officer can testify to his behavior that is highly relevant to this case." The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "It is unconventional, Miss Carter, but given the circumstances and the role of this K-9 in the investigation, I will allow it. Proceed carefully." The murmurs swelled again as Officer Daniels stood, gently patting the side of his German Shepherd, Rex. The dog rose gracefully, his tail low but wagging slightly as he walked with Daniels toward the witness stand. His presence immediately commanded attention, powerful, yet calm, disciplined, yet instinctive. The jurors straightened in their seats, their pens poised. Some smiled faintly, perhaps charmed by the animal, while others watched with cautious intrigue. The defense, however, exchanged skeptical looks. Callahan folded his arms, his lips pressed into a thin line, already crafting his rebuttal. Daniels testified with steady clarity. He described arriving at the scene that night, how Rex had reacted sharply near the alleyway, barking and growling in a manner that signaled danger. He recalled how Rex had pulled toward a specific area, where later evidence had been recovered. He explained how the dog's instincts had repeatedly drawn attention to places connected directly to the accused. Still, Callahan was quick to pounce during cross-examination. "Officer, with all due respect," he said smoothly, "dogs bark at many things: cats, shadows, the wind. How can this jury possibly rely on the actions of an animal as evidence of guilt?" Daniels stood firm. "Rex is not an ordinary dog. He's a trained canine officer with years of experience. He doesn't bark at shadows. He signals when something is wrong, and that night, he signaled directly in connection with the defendant." The exchange left the jury thoughtful, but not yet convinced. The courtroom buzzed with mixed reactions, some people nodding in agreement, others frowning in doubt. It was then, as Rex sat obediently beside Daniels, that something entirely unexpected happened. From the second row, the little girl who had been silent all morning shifted in her seat. Her teddy bear slipped slightly in her lap as she leaned forward, eyes fixed on the German Shepherd. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her arm, whispering, "Stay quiet, sweetheart." But the girl couldn't. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the dog, the very same dog she remembered from that terrifying night. Her small hands trembled as she clutched her teddy tighter. Melissa noticed the movement. So did several jurors, who glanced curiously at the child. The judge raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. And in that moment, the air in the courtroom shifted, subtle yet undeniable. It wasn't the officer's testimony that had drawn this sudden wave of attention. It was the girl, the quiet figure no one had expected to matter. She sat there, staring at the K9, as though he held a secret that only she could see. Callahan, sensing the shift, sneered slightly and leaned toward his client. "Don't worry," he muttered. "She's just a kid." But deep down, even he felt a flicker of unease. The courtroom returned to routine as Daniel stepped down with Rex, but the moment had left its mark. The little girl's silent presence, her unwavering focus on the dog, had unsettled more than just a few observers. As the judge prepared to call a recess, Melissa glanced at the child. Something about her eyes wide, haunted, and fixated on the K9 sent a chill down the prosecutor's spine. She realized with startling clarity that this case might not rest on the evidence presented in boxes of files and exhibits. It might rest on something much smaller, quieter, and far more unexpected. The defense thought the dog's presence was a weakness. The jury thought it was unusual. But Melissa sensed it was something else entirely. A door waiting to be opened. And a little girl sitting silently in the second row? She just might hold the key. The courtroom slowly settled after the unusual testimony of Officer Daniels and his K9 partner. Reporters bent their heads together, whispering about whether a dog could truly shift the weight of a trial. The defense still looked smug, convinced. The jurors wouldn't take the demonstration seriously. The jury itself seemed divided, some intrigued by Rex's behavior, others unconvinced. But while everyone else dissected what had just happened, the little girl in the second row had grown restless. Her small shoes tapped lightly against the wooden bench as she gripped her teddy bear tighter. She looked tiny against the vast backdrop of the courtroom. The tall ceilings, the looming flags, the imposing seal of justice. And yet, her presence was quietly commanding, if anyone had cared to notice. Her mother kept glancing down at her, whispering words meant to soothe. "It's all right, darling. We'll be going home soon. Just keep quiet for Mommy, okay?" The girl nodded, but her wide brown eyes betrayed her. They weren't fixed on her mother, nor on the defendant, nor even on the stern figure of Judge Whitman. They were locked unwavering on Rex, the German. Shepard sitting proudly near the witness stand. There was something in that gaze that unsettled Melissa Carter. As the prosecutor, she had trained herself to read body language. Jurors, witnesses, even opposing counsel. And now, as she returned to her table, she noticed the girl's fixed attention. It wasn't idle curiosity. It was something deeper, heavier. The child's breathing was fast, her knuckles white where they clutched the teddy bear's arm. Melissa had seen fear before, but this wasn't just fear. It was memory. Melissa leaned slightly toward her investigator, lowering her voice. "Do you know who that little girl is?" she asked. The investigator followed her gaze. "Second row? With the pigtails?" He shook his head. "Not on any of our witness lists." Melissa frowned. That struck her as odd. Courtrooms often saw relatives of victims or curious townsfolk in attendance, but something told her this wasn't random. Children didn't sit through trials like this, not unless they had a reason. Across the room, Callahan had noticed too. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, a mocking smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He whispered something to Reeves, and though the defendant didn't respond, his jaw tightened ever so slightly. That small flicker, barely visible, unless you were looking for it, did not escape Melissa's sharp eyes. She tucked the observation away, her instincts prickling. The judge called for a short recess, giving the jury a chance to stretch and the attorneys a moment to regroup. A murmur of voices filled the chamber again. Reporters rushed toward the doors to make their phone calls, and the bailiff reminded everyone to remain orderly. Amid the shifting and shuffling, the little girl stayed seated, frozen in place. Her gaze on Rex hadn't broken once. The officer crouched beside his canine, scratching behind the dog's ear. Rex leaned into the touch, but kept stealing glances at the second row. It was subtle, just small turns of his head, his ears pricking slightly. But Melissa noticed it. The dog recognized something too. The recess ended quickly, and everyone filed back into place. The judge's gavel brought the room to order once more, and Melissa rose to call the next witness. She tried to keep her focus on the legal strategy she had mapped out, but her thoughts kept drifting to the little girl and the dog. Something in her gut told her those two were connected, and the connection might be important. As testimony continued, the girl began to fidget. Her small legs swung faster, her teddy bear pressed tightly against her chest, as though she needed its comfort more with each passing second. She bit her lower lip until it turned pale, her eyes shining with the threat of tears. A juror noticed her and glanced over briefly, then back at the witness. Another spectator nudged a companion, whispering about how strange it was to see such a young child in such a grim trial. The judge himself finally looked over, his brow furrowing slightly at the sight of her obvious distress. Then it happened. As Rex shifted beside his handler, the dog's eyes flicked once more toward the little girl. This time, the girl leaned forward sharply, nearly tumbling off the bench. She whispered something too faint to be heard, but her lips moved clearly. Her mother quickly hushed her, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. But it was too late. Several pairs of eyes had caught the movement, including the prosecutors. Melissa's mind raced. Why was this child reacting so strongly? To the police dog? What had Rex done or not done that triggered such an intense response? She forced herself to remain composed at her table, but her instincts screamed that there was more here than met the eye. The defense, too, noticed. Callahan raised an eyebrow, whispering again to Reeves. This time, the defendant's reaction was stronger. He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against the table. To most, it was a meaningless gesture. To Melissa, it was confirmation. Reeves recognized the girl. But how? The rest of the testimony that day blurred into routine. Yet a silent tension lingered. Every so often, the girl's mother leaned down to whisper reassurances, but the child never stopped staring. Her teddy bear became her shield, her anchor, her only way of keeping steady in a room heavy with secrets she couldn't yet voice. As the session drew to a close, Judge Whitman reminded the jury of their duties and dismissed them for the day. The courtroom began to empty, but Melissa Carter stayed behind a moment longer, her eyes fixed on the little girl. She watched as the mother gently guided her toward the doors, the teddy bear tucked under one arm. Just before stepping out, the girl looked back one last glance at Rex, the police dog who sat tall, ears pricked, watching her leave. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't chance. That look carried weight, as though threads of truth stretched invisibly between child and dog, waiting to be pulled. Melissa gathered her files, but her mind wasn't on the paperwork. It was on the child. Who was she? Why wasn't she listed as a witness? And why did the accused react, however subtly, to her presence? The answers weren't clear yet. But Melissa knew one thing for certain. The trial that had already been unusual was about to take a turn no one could have anticipated. And in the middle of it all was a girl too young to understand legal strategies, too small to argue with adults, but carrying something that could tilt the balance of justice. She didn't know it yet, but soon, her voice fragile, trembling, and unexpected, would silence the entire courtroom. The courtroom, by the third day of testimony, had become a place where silence weighed more than words. Every shuffle of paper, every cough, every creak of the wooden benches felt amplified, echoing in the ears of jurors and spectators alike. The case had reached a delicate balance, each side clinging to their strategies. Melissa Carter, the prosecutor, had been careful with her witnesses. She had lined them up strategically. The neighbor who had heard shouting, the forensic expert who analyzed fibers, the officer who recounted procedures. But despite her precision, she knew the defense had succeeded in planting seeds of doubt. Every time a witness faltered under cross-examination, every time Callahan raised his booming voice and questioned the certainty of evidence, the balance shifted slightly in Reeves's favor. Still, Melissa had noticed the undercurrents others missed. The girl in the second row staring at Rex, the defendant's subtle reactions, the growing unease among jurors who wanted something definitive, something that could pierce through the fog of doubt. On this day, the atmosphere felt different. The judge, sitting high above the courtroom, rubbed his temple with visible weariness. The jury sat straighter, eyes sharp, as though they sensed a turning point. Reporters leaned forward in anticipation, waiting for a moment worth printing in bold headlines. The defense team exuded confidence. Callahan had just dismantled another witness's certainty, his theatrics convincing enough to draw a few approving nods from the gallery. He returned to his seat with a self-satisfied smile, his client looking composed as ever. Melissa, however, remained calm. She had been watching the girl throughout the morning. Today, her fidgeting had grown worse. The teddy bear's fabric had darkened where her hands gripped it, her knuckles white. She leaned forward more often, her wide eyes darting nervously between the German shepherd and the man at the defense table. Finally, unable to ignore it, Melissa rose slowly from her seat. She smoothed her jacket, glanced at the jury, then at the judge. Her heart thumped, but her voice was steady. "Your Honor," she began, "before I call my next witness, I must ask the court's permission to address an observation." Callahan shot up instantly. "Objection," he barked. "This is highly irregular. If counsel has a witness, she should call them properly. This is not the time for vague observations." The judge raised a hand, silencing the defense attorney. "Ms. Carter, proceed, but tread carefully." Melissa nodded and turned slightly, her gaze settling on the second row. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she said softly, "there is a young girl here who has been present each day. While she has not been called as a witness, her behavior indicates she may hold knowledge relevant to this case." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. The judge banged his gavel once. "Order." Callahan's voice rose, his tone dripping with mockery. "Are we to believe now that the prosecution intends to rely on the testimony of a child? What's next trial? By fairy tale?" A few uneasy chuckles escaped the gallery, but the judge's glare silenced them instantly. Melissa didn't waver. She turned toward the girl, lowering her voice as though addressing only her. "Sweetheart, would you like to say something?" The air shifted. The courtroom, once alive with murmurs and motion, became still. Spectators held their breath. Jurors froze, pens hovering above notepads. Even the defense, so quick with interruptions, fell silent as every eye turned toward the little girl clutching her teddy bear. Her mother stiffened, whispering urgently, "No, darling, stay quiet. We're not here for that." She placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes pleading with Melissa to leave them alone. But the child didn't respond to her mother. Her gaze stayed locked on Rex, the German shepherd, as though sensing the moment, had lifted his head. His ears pricked forward, his body still but alert. The connection between them was palpable, a thread invisible yet unbreakable. The judge leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "Young lady," he said gently, "do you have something you'd like to share?" For a moment, the girl froze. Her small lips parted, but no words came out. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her tiny fingers digging into the teddy bear. Her mother whispered again, more firmly this time, It's okay, sweetheart. You don't need to. The silence stretched. It wasn't just silence, it was heavy, charged, electric. People leaned forward waiting, wondering if the girl would speak, or if this tense moment would dissolve back into routine proceedings. Then, slowly, the child slid off the bench. Her shoes clicked softly against the wooden floor as she stood. She looked impossibly small, her head barely reaching the rail in front of the spectator section. She didn't look at her mother, nor at the judge. Her eyes never left the dog. Melissa's throat tightened. She had seen countless witnesses take the stand, but never one this young, never one this fragile. And yet, there was something about the girl's stance, trembling but determined, that struck her as braver than any testimony delivered from the box. The jury watched with rapt attention. One juror, an elderly woman in the front row, pressed a hand to her chest as though holding in her own breath. Another scribbled furiously, though what he could write about a silence this profound was anyone's guess. Callahan shifted in his seat, his smirk gone. He opened his mouth to object again, but closed it when he saw Reeves. For the first time, the defendant's mask had cracked. His jaw tightened, his hands gripped the edge of the table, and a flicker of unease crossed his otherwise calm expression. The girl's voice, when it finally came, was almost a whisper. I need to say something." Her mother shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. But the judge, leaning forward with a surprising gentleness, said, "You may speak, child. You're safe here." The words seemed to steady her. She took a shaky breath, lifted her small hand, and pointed directly toward Rex. The gasp that followed was collective, like the entire room had inhaled at once. The girl's small hand hovered in the air, trembling as she pointed directly at the police dog. The courtroom, moments earlier buzzing with whispers and tension, now fell into a silence so deep it was almost suffocating. Every eye followed her tiny finger, as though it were a compass guiding them toward an undiscovered truth. Melissa Carter felt her pulse in her ears. This wasn't planned. It wasn't a part of her strategy, her evidence list, or her closing arguments. But sometimes trials didn't bend to strategies. They bent to truth, raw and unexpected. And truth, she sensed, was trembling before them in a pair of small sneakers. The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of his lips. He studied the child carefully, his expression difficult to read. For years he had presided over countless trials, seen hardened criminals and terrified witnesses. But there was something different about this moment. Something that carried weight beyond procedure. The jury leaned forward almost in unison. 12 strangers bound by duty, suddenly drawn together by the sight of a little girl pointing at a German shepherd. One juror even adjusted his glasses, as though afraid he might be misinterpreting what was unfolding before him. The German shepherd Rex sat tall and alert. His deep brown eyes flickered toward the child and back toward the defendant, as though he, too, understood the gravity of what was happening. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He only sat, waiting, embodying the loyalty and quiet power that had made him a trusted K-9 on the force. The defendant, Daniel Reeves, shifted in his seat. For the first time since the trial began, his confident mask slipped. His jaw tightened, and a sheen of sweat began forming at his temple. His attorney, Callahan, noticed instantly and leaned in, whispering urgently, but Reeves brushed him off with a stiff shake of his head. Callahan rose anyway. "Your Honor," he said, his voice echoing louder than necessary, "this is absurd. We cannot allow the ramblings of a child, an unqualified, unvetted, emotionally fragile child, to dictate the course of this trial. With all due respect, the prosecution is playing to sympathy, nothing more." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Callahan, sit down." His voice carried the weight of authority, sharpened over decades on the bench. Melissa didn't speak. She knew she didn't need to. The girl's gesture spoke louder than any argument she could muster. Still, she stepped forward slightly, her tone calm but firm. No one here is dictating anything, Your Honor. But when a child chooses to speak unsolicited about the very events we are here to examine, perhaps we owe her the respect of listening. The judge let the words hang in the air. He turned toward the girl, whose finger was still raised. "Young lady," he said, his voice softer now, "can you tell us why you're pointing at the dog?" The gallery seemed to hold its collective breath. The girl lowered her hand slowly, but kept her eyes locked on Rex. Her lips parted, and for a moment, no sound came. Her mother squeezed her shoulder gently, torn between pride and fear. She whispered, "You don't have to do this, sweetheart." But the child straightened her small frame, clutching the teddy bear to her chest like a shield. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was fragile yet steady. "Because he knows." He was there. The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was immediate. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the weight of realization, of connection, of something greater than coincidence. Callahan leapt to his feet again, his tone sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculation from a minor who doesn't even understand what testimony means. This is outrageous." The judge silenced him with a glare. Overruled. Melissa's heart soared. The door had cracked open, and she knew the truth was about to burst through. The little girl's eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't falter. She pointed again at Rex, her small hand trembling. "That night, I was hiding. He barked. He barked so loud, and it made the bad man run." The words were simple, childlike, yet in their simplicity, they struck harder than any polished testimony. Gasps escaped from the gallery, and even one juror lifted a hand to her mouth in shock. Daniel Reeves shifted again, this time more violently. His knee bounced under the table, and his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his seat. Callahan placed a hand on his client's arm to still him, but Reeves shrugged him off with a scowl, his composure unraveling. Melissa stepped closer to the child, careful not to frighten her. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "are you saying Rex barked when the man came near you that night?" The girl nodded, clutching the teddy bear tighter. "Yes, I was so scared, but Rex barked, and it made him stop. It made him run." The weight of her words lingered in the air. They weren't technical, they weren't forensic, but they aligned perfectly with the timeline Melissa had constructed. The K-9's behavior that night had been logged in police reports. He had barked aggressively at Reeves during the suspect's arrest, but hearing it from the lips of a child who had lived, the terror firsthand changed everything. Callahan scrambled, his voice cracking slightly as he objected again. "This is hearsay. A child misremembering events likely coached by the prosecution. This cannot be considered credible evidence." But the judge's response was firm. "Mr. Callahan, the jury will decide what weight to give her words. You will sit down and refrain from interrupting." The defense attorney's face flushed red, but he obeyed, sinking back into his chair with a frustrated thud. The girl, emboldened now, lowered her hand but continued speaking. "I remember his eyes," she whispered, glancing toward Reeves. "He was angry. He said no one would ever believe me. But Rex did. He barked at him." The room collectively turned toward the defendant. Reeves froze, his eyes darting back and forth as if searching for escape. For the first time, the man who had sat so smugly through days of testimony looked cornered. Melissa let the silence stretch, knowing every heartbeat that passed only deepened the impact of what the jury had just heard. She finally turned toward them, her voice quiet but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes the truth isn't complicated. Sometimes it comes down to a child's memory and a dog's instinct. That night, Rex barked because he recognized danger. Because he recognized him. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions grim. The once fragile case had shifted on its axis. What had been seeds of doubt planted by the defense were now being uprooted by the raw, unpolished words of a child. The girl sank back into her seat beside her mother, her chest rising and falling rapidly, as if the effort of speaking had drained her. But there was a quiet strength in her eyes now, a relief that she had finally spoken aloud what she had held inside for so long. Rex, as if in silent acknowledgement, lowered his head and rested it on his handler's knee. The gesture was simple, but to those watching, it looked like affirmation, like loyalty, proving itself once more. And in that moment, though the verdict had not yet been delivered, the tide of the trial had unmistakably turned. The courtroom was silent in, but this silence was different from before. It wasn't filled with curiosity. It was heavy, almost suffocating, charged with the weight of revelation. Every person in the room was frozen, caught between disbelief and awe. The little girl had said 2 words. He barked. Simple words. Ordinary words. Yet, in the context of this trial, they carried a thunderclap of meaning. They weren't just an observation. They were testimony. Testimony that linked a frightened child, a loyal police dog, and the accused man sitting at the defense table. Alyssa Carter stood still for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. She had learned long ago that silence, when timed correctly, could be as persuasive as speech. And right now, the silence wrapping those words was deafening. The judge leaned forward, his gavel resting unused in his hand. His usually impassive expression had softened, just slightly, revealing a trace of something uncharacteristic, empathy. He glanced at the jury, then back at the child, then at Rex. The jury members were visibly shaken. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others scribbled notes furiously. One juror, a middle-aged man who had remained skeptical throughout the trial, now tapped his pen against the pad in front of him, his lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes, however, never left the defendant. The defendant himself, Daniel Reeves, looked pale. The confident posture he had carried like armor was cracking. His jaw twitched. His eyes darted from the little girl to Rex, and back again, as if trapped between 2 mirrors reflecting his guilt. His attorney, Callahan, tried to recover. He stood quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "Your Honor, I must object again. This is highly irregular and entirely prejudicial. A child's emotional recollection, colored by trauma and suggestion, must not be the foundation of this case." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Callahan, the jury will determine the weight of this child's words. You will sit down." The defense attorney's face flushed crimson. He obeyed reluctantly, but the damage was done. His outburst only highlighted the importance of what the girl had said. Melissa took a careful step closer to the child, her voice soft. "Sweetheart, you said Rex barked. Can you tell us what you remember about that night?" The girl hugged her teddy bear tighter, her small knuckles pressing into its worn fabric. She nodded hesitantly, her voice trembling but audible. "I was in the closet. Mommy told me to hide because someone was in the house. It was dark, and I was scared. I could hear footsteps. And then?" Her eyes flickered to Rex. "Then he barked, loud. It scared me, but it scared the man more. He stopped, and he ran." A wave of whispers spread through the courtroom. The image was stark vivid in its innocence. A child hiding in terror, a dog standing between her and danger, a criminal driven away by loyalty and instinct. Melissa let her continue, careful not to rush. "Did you see the man?" she asked gently. The girl's lips quivered, and her eyes shifted toward the defense table. She hesitated, then whispered, "Yes, I saw him. He looked at me before he ran. The courtroom gasped collectively, as though air had been sucked out of the room. All eyes turned toward Reeves. The man's face darkened, his jaw clenched, and his hand twitched as though he wanted to slam it against the table. Melissa steadied herself. This was dangerous ground. The defense would accuse her of leading the witness. She needed the girl to continue on her own terms. And what happened after he ran? She asked softly. The child took a shaky breath. Rex came to me. He didn't bark anymore. He just sat by me until the police came. He kept me safe. Her small voice cracked on the last word, and her mother quickly wrapped an arm around her, tears streaming down her cheeks. The gallery shifted uneasily, some spectators wiping their own eyes. Even the court reporter, usually mechanical in her typing, paused for a second to compose herself. Melissa nodded. "Thank you, sweetheart. You've been very brave." She turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness." The judge nodded solemnly. "Mr. Callahan, your cross-examination." Callahan rose, his smile tight and forced. He knew he was walking on glass. Any harshness toward the child could backfire with the jury. But if he didn't challenge her, Reeves's fate was sealed. He approached slowly, lowering his voice to a calm, almost patronizing tone. "Hello there. My name is Mr. Callahan. I just want to ask you a few questions, okay?" A girl shrank slightly against her mother, but nodded. "You said it was dark that night," Callahan began. "Very dark. Are you sure you really saw someone? Isn't it possible your imagination was playing tricks on you?" The child frowned, her voice quiet but firm. "No, I saw him." Callahan pressed on. "But you were frightened, weren't you? Very frightened. Sometimes, when we're scared, we think we see things that aren't really there." The girl shook her head, gripping her teddy tighter. "I saw him." Callahan's smile faltered, but he forced another question. "And you say Rex barked. Dogs bark all the time, don't they? Maybe Rex was just barking at the wind, or a noise outside. Dogs don't always bark for a reason." This time, the girl's answer was immediate, her voice stronger. "No, he barked at him." She lifted her hand again and pointed directly at Reeves. The effect was devastating. Gasps and murmurs filled the room once more. The jurors leaned forward, eyes wide, their pens forgotten. Even the judge's brows lifted, his expression grave. Callahan froze. For the first time in his career, words failed him. He tried to recover, stammering, You can't be sure of that, can you?" But the child didn't waver. "I am sure. Rex barked at him, and he looked at me. I'll never forget his eyes." The silence that followed was crushing. Callahan retreated, muttering, "No further questions," his face pale. He sank back into his seat, his hands trembling slightly. Reeves glared at him with unmasked fury, but Callahan didn't dare meet his client's eyes. Melissa glanced at the jury. Their expressions said everything. The doubt that had lingered throughout the trial was gone. What remained was conviction firm. Unshakable conviction. The judge finally broke the silence. "The testimony will stand. The court acknowledges the extraordinary bravery of this child." He looked toward the little girl, his voice softening. "Young lady, you may step down. Thank you." Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering soothing words as they returned to their seat. Rex, still by his handler's side, watched her with calm, steady eyes. When she passed, she reached out a small hand and brushed his fur. The dog's tail wagged once, slow and deliberate, like a silent promise fulfilled. Melissa sat down, her heart still racing. She had seen trials turn on evidence, on confessions, on clever arguments, but never like this. Never with 2 words. From a child that shattered the defense's wall of denial. In that moment, She knew the trial was no longer about strategies or technicalities. It was about truth. And the truth had just been spoken in the simplest, purest way possible. And no jury in the world could ignore it. The courtroom felt different after the girl's testimony. The walls themselves seemed to hum with the weight of her words. Even after she returned to her seat, her teddy bear clutched tight in her arms, the echoes of "he barked" lingered. They were etched into every mind present, jurors, lawyers, judge, and spectators alike. Melissa Carter knew the tide had shifted. She had spent weeks threading her case to gather physical evidence, eyewitnesses, timelines, but it had always felt like a puzzle missing its keystone. The girl had given them that missing piece. Not with data, not with science, but with memory, instinct, and truth. Melissa rose once more, gathering her papers though she hardly needed them. She turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the bravery of a child who had no reason to lie." Her words aligned perfectly with the evidence we've already presented. She walked slowly, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. "You've seen the police reports that document Rex's behavior the night of the crime. He barked fiercely, consistently only at one man, Daniel Reeves." Her eyes shifted toward the defendant, whose composure was fraying. Sweat beaded along his hairline. His once confident posture had collapsed into a rigid, defensive hunch. His hands clenched, the edge of the table, knuckles pale. Melissa continued, her voice steady but firm. "You've seen the fibers on the victim's clothing. You've heard from the neighbor who saw a man of Mr. Reeves's build fleeing that night. And now, you've heard from the only living eyewitness, a child, who confirms what the evidence has always suggested." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the jury. When Rex barked, it wasn't at shadows or the wind. It was at him. She pointed toward Reeves, the finality in her gesture ringing louder than any gavel. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions heavy with realization. The once wavering juror in the front row leaned back, nodding subtly to himself. Another scribbled notes with fierce determination. Callahan, Reeves's attorney, scrambled. He pushed his chair back abruptly and stood, his voice louder than necessary. "Your Honor, the prosecution is weaving fantasy. Dogs bark all the time. Children imagine things. This is not evidence, it's theater." The judge's gavel cracked against the block. "Mr. Callahan, you will sit down. The jury will decide what is evidence." His tone left no room for debate. Melissa hid her relief behind a composed expression. Callahan's desperation was unraveling his credibility in front of the very people he needed most. She turned back to the jury, softening her tone. "This case isn't about theater. It's about truth. And the truth has revealed itself, not through rehearsed testimony or elaborate stories, but through the courage of a little girl who had every reason to stay silent and chose not to." The gallery shifted, spectators murmuring, some wiping. Tears. Even the stoic court officer near the door cleared his throat, blinking rapidly. Reeves shifted again, his eyes darting wildly. He leaned toward Callahan, hissing words too low to hear. Callahan's face reddened as he shook his head. The dynamic between them had flipped, the attorney no longer the confident orchestrator, but the cornered servant of a desperate man. Melissa returned to her seat, satisfied. The foundation had been laid. She didn't need to press further. The jury already carried the weight of what they had seen and heard. But then something happened, something she hadn't expected. Rex, lying at his handler's side, lifted his head and stared directly at Reeves. His ears pricked, his body tense. And then, in the hushed stillness of the courtroom, a low growl rumbled in his chest. It wasn't loud, but it was primal, unmistakable, vibrating through the air. Gasps erupted from the gallery. The jurors flinched, some leaning back in their chairs, eyes wide. The handler immediately tugged lightly at Rex's collar, whispering, "Easy, boy, easy." But the dog's gaze never left Reeves. It was instinct pure, unfiltered instinct. And in a courtroom that had just heard testimony about that very instinct, the moment landed like a hammer blow. Callahan sprang to his feet. "Objection. This is outrageous. The animal is being used to prejudice the jury." The judge's gavel slammed again. "Sit down, Mr. Callahan. The court will note the dog's behavior, but remind the jury to weigh only proper evidence." His words were formal, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Melissa couldn't have scripted it better. The timing was uncanny, almost poetic. The jurors, though instructed otherwise, would never forget the sight of Rex growling at Reeves, the same man the little girl had identified moments earlier. The defense tried to recover. Callahan called a character witness, a co-worker of Reeves, to testify to his kindness and reliability. But the man's words rang hollow against the backdrop of what had just unfolded. The jury's faces remained impassive, their minds clearly elsewhere. Melissa cross-examined swiftly. "Mr. Reynolds, were you with the defendant the night of the crime?" "No," the man admitted. "Did you see him that night? Speak to him? Have any knowledge of his whereabouts?" The witness shifted. Uncomfortably. "No, thank you. No further questions." The brevity of the exchange only underscored the irrelevance of the defense's tactics. By late afternoon, the prosecution rested its case. Melissa's closing arguments would come later, but she knew the battle was already tilting heavily in her favor. The judge dismissed the jury for the day, instructing them not to discuss the case outside the courtroom. As the jurors filed out, many stole one last glance at Rex, then at the little girl who had changed everything. When the courtroom finally emptied, Melissa packed her files slowly. She glanced toward the child and her mother. The girl looked exhausted, her small head resting against her mother's shoulder, eyes half closed. Yet there was a peace in her face, a relief that came only from speaking the truth. Rex lay quietly, his earlier tension gone, his body relaxed. But Melissa knew what everyone else in that room knew now. The case wasn't just about evidence anymore. It was about instinct, loyalty, and the courage to name the truth when it mattered most. As the bailiff locked the doors and the lights dimmed, Melissa allowed herself the faintest smile. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, the defense's last desperate attempts, and finally the jury's verdict. But tonight she carried with her the sound of a child's voice, fragile, yet unshakable, echoing through the courtroom. He barked, two words that had unraveled the defense, pierced the jury's doubt, and laid bare the truth for all to see. The final day of the trial dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself knew the gravity of what was about to unfold. By the time court was called to session, the gallery was packed beyond capacity. Reporters scribbled feverishly in their notepads. Cameras clicked outside the doors, and ordinary citizens waited in hushed anticipation. Everyone knew they were about to witness history, justice balancing on the edge of a child's voice and a dog's instinct. Melissa Carter arrived early. Her files were organized, though she barely needed them anymore. The case had taken on a life of its own. The evidence and testimony had burned themselves into the minds of every juror. Still, she rehearsed her closing arguments silently, steadying her breathing. This was not the moment for complacency. Across the room, Daniel Reeves sat with a hollow look, his once defined posture completely gone. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, his jaw clenched tightly. His attorney, Callahan, whispered urgently to him, but Reeves only stared blankly ahead. It was the look of a man who sensed his world collapsing. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The judge entered, taking his seat with a solemn nod. "You may be seated. Counselors, are we prepared for closing arguments?" Melissa rose. "The state is ready, Your Honor." Callahan adjusted his tie nervously. The defense is ready. The judge's gaze shifted toward Melissa. Proceed. She stepped forward, her heels echoing on the polished wood. She didn't bother shuffling through her notes. Instead, she looked directly at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, over the course of this trial, you've seen the truth unfold piece by piece. You've heard the testimony of witnesses. You've examined the physical evidence. You've heard from experts, investigators, and ordinary citizens. But what brought everything together was the courage of a child. She gestured toward the little girl, sitting quietly with her mother in the front row. That child had no agenda, no understanding of legal strategy, no reason to lie. She spoke only what she saw and heard. And what she told you was simple. Rex, the police dog, barked. He barked at one man. The man sitting right there. She pointed at Reeves. Her voice strengthened, filling the room. And let's remember, dogs don't conspire. They don't testify for fame. They don't lie. Rex barked because he sensed the truth. And that truth was confirmed when this child, without hesitation, pointed to the defendant and uttered those two words. Melissa's eyes swept the jury. Some leaned forward, hanging on every syllable. Others nodded slowly, their expressions resolute. Daniel Reeves thought he could silence his victim. He thought he could erase the evidence. But the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, through fibers, through witnesses, through the instincts of a dog, and through the innocence of a child. That is what you've seen here. That is justice demanding to be heard. She paused, allowing the silence to sink in. I ask you to return a verdict of guilty, not because it's easy, not because it's dramatic, but because it is the truth. Melissa returned to her seat, calm but inwardly trembling with the enormity of the moment. Now it was Callahan's turn. He rose slowly, shoulders slumped, eyes darting nervously. His voice wavered at first, but grew louder as he forced confidence into his words. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to base your verdict on a child's story and a dog's bark. This isn't evidence, it's emotion. My client is a man who deserves the presumption of innocence. Where is the hard proof? Where is the DNA? Where is the certainty beyond a reasonable doubt? But the jury's faces told the story. They were unmoved. The more Callahan spoke, the more hollow his words became. His arguments rang as thin as paper against the steel weight of the testimony they'd already heard. Finally, he slumped back into his chair, sweat visible on his brow. The judge looked to the jury. You have heard the evidence and the arguments. You are now instructed to deliberate. The jurors filed out, the heavy door closing behind them. The room buzzed with hushed conversations, nervous shifting, and the scratching of pens on paper. Melissa exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. She'd done all she could. Now it rested in the hands of 12 strangers. The wait stretched unbearably long. Every tick of the courtroom clock seemed louder than the last. The little girl clung to her mother's arm, Rex resting quietly at his handler's feet, his head on his paws. Reeves sat motionless, eyes locked on the table before him. Then an hour later the door opened. The jury had returned. Will the foreperson please rise? The judge intoned. A woman in the front row of the jury stood, holding a folded slip of paper. Her face was pale but resolute. The bailiff took the note and handed it to the judge, who unfolded it, scanning briefly before nodding. He handed it back. Madam Foreperson, please read the verdict. The courtroom froze. We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Reeves, guilty of all charges. The words detonated like thunder. Gasps, muffled sobs, even cheers rippled through the gallery before the judge's gavel slammed down. Order! Order in the court! Reeves's face twisted, fury and despair crashing together. He shouted something unintelligible, slamming his fist against the table, but deputies immediately restrained him, pulling his arms behind his back. Callahan buried his face in his hands. Melissa closed her eyes for a moment, relief washing through her like a tidal wave. Justice had prevailed. The little girl pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, whispering softly. Her mother stroked her hair, tears running freely down her cheeks. And then, as if to seal the moment, Rex lifted his head. With the calm dignity of a soldier who had done his duty, he barked once loud, clear, and final. The entire courtroom fell silent. It was as if everyone understood. The dog had spoken too. The judge set the sentencing date, dismissed the jury with heartfelt thanks, and adjourned. But no one moved right away. They lingered, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Melissa finally gathered her things and approached the little girl and her mother. She crouched down, her voice gentle. "You were so brave. Do you know that? You helped make the truth known." The child nodded, clutching her teddy bear. "Rex helped me." Melissa smiled, her throat tight with emotion. "Yes, he did. You both did." The handler gave Rex a pat, and the dog wagged his tail once, content. Outside, the storm clouds had broken. A shaft of sunlight pierced through, spilling across the courthouse steps. As Melissa exited with her team, she looked up at the sky and allowed herself a deep breath. Justice wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always quick. But today, in this courtroom, it had triumphed thanks to the loyalty of a dog, the innocence of a child, and the persistence of truth. The story would be told for years to come, recounted in news articles, law journals, and whispered conversations. But for those who had been there, it would never be just a story. It was a reminder. Sometimes justice arrives in the simplest words, spoken by the smallest voices. 2 words. He barked.